Hello, Dr. John Kavanaugh, aka State Senator John Kavanaugh back, and this is Lesson 2, the major reforms that have shaped state legislatures. So let's begin. So state legislatures are ever-evolving institutions. They're constantly changing with the times, particularly to keep up with the technology and also cultural changes. So state legislatures have adopted and rejected many reforms over the years. And what shapes these reforms and whether legislators accept them or reject them or accept them and later dump them are their own unique situations and external forces, especially the courts and the executive branches. And I'm talking both the governor's office and the U.S. president's office, because they all do things that affect us, be it through executive orders or their agency heads doing things and creating regulations and unfunded mandates and everything else. So the first big reform was single-member districts. Now remember, a legislative district is the boundary of the district. For example, in Arizona, we have 30 legislative districts. Each one has roughly the same population for fairness. So they're the district maps. Initially, some state legislative districts were plural, meaning there was more than one legislator representing each district. So you might have one district with 5 legislators in it. And so voters would have to elect 5 people. Legislators were often elected in those districts by less than 50% of the votes cast. Because if you're voting for 5 people, you're going to have some people who could get in theoretically with only 22, 23% of the people voting for them. So plural districts therefore let candidates with little support of the population get elected. They also made legislators less accountable because plural districts were larger than single legislator districts. If you're going to have 5 legislators in a district and you only have maybe 50 in the whole state, you're only going to have 10 districts. Whereas if you had one legislator in a state with 50 legislators, you would have 50 districts. So they became very large, these districts. And large districts are much more difficult to represent. It's harder to keep in touch with the people. It's harder to find out what they want. And it's also difficult to do constituent services with so many people asking you to do things. And it's also easier, because the responsibility is dispersed among groups of legislators, it makes it easier for them to sidestep their responsibility to serve their constituents, claiming, oh, I thought Joe did it, or I thought Mary did it. I didn't know it wasn't done. So plural districts were not that great a thing to have. It was also easier to gerrymander large districts. Now, gerrymandering is drawing the district lines to favor the political party in power who draws the lines. And if they're really big, you've got a lot more space to play with. We'll discuss gerrymandering later on. Plural districts also invite single-shot voting, and this weakens the democratic process. Now, let me explain what single-shot voting is. Because in Arizona, we're one of the few states that in the House has a plural district. While we have 30 districts, 1 senator, but we also have 2 representatives in each district. So when it's time to vote every 2 years for state representatives, people get to choose 2. And you might have, in the primary, you might have, a lot of people running. And in the general election, each party will have 2 people running. So single-shot voting is you tell people to only vote for 1 candidate. And the reason why it gives that single-shot voter more of a say is that they vote for the candidate they want, and their second vote doesn't help any of the other candidates who could be a threat to the candidate that they like. So that's called single-shot voting. In general elections, it's very common for the minority party in that district to tell all of their voters to only vote for the one Republican, say, candidate in an election to give that candidate a better chance against the Democrats also running. So it's called single-shot voting. It's gaming the system. So states began switching to single-member districts in the early 19th century, and they're pretty much the norm today, except, again, Arizona with 2-member House districts. Third-party candidates can either be spoilers or use their influence by endorsing major party candidates. No third-party candidate is going to get elected in a district because third parties are very small. They have, maybe 5% of the voters, and most people, especially in down-ballot races like legislative races, they vote for either the Republican or the Democrat. So your third-party candidates generally become spoilers. So in Arizona, you have two major third parties. You have the Green Party and the Libertarian Party. So the Libertarian Party kind of appeals more to conservative Republicans, and the Green Party, being environmentalists, favored a bit more by Democrat candidates. So when they run in an election where there's a Republican and Democrat running, the Libertarian will take votes away from the Republican, and the Green Party candidate will take votes away from the Democrat. Now, if there's both a Green and a Libertarian running in the race, it kind of balances out. But if there's only one of those parties running, then they will drain some votes from either the Republican or Democrat parties, depending on which one is running. So, and we call that a spoiler candidate. Now, smart third parties do endorsements. We don't have smart third parties in Arizona. They don't give their endorsements to a Democrat or Republican who they believe will follow their principles reasonably close. When I was young, first getting involved in politics, I was working for the Conservative Party of New York State. There was also a Liberal Party of New York State. And the tactic of these parties was the Conservative Party would go to the Republican and say, if you promise to do these really conservative things, we'll give you our endorsement. And then all the people who are registered Republicans will tend to vote for you. If you don't, then we will run a separate Conservative Party candidate, and that will drain votes away from you. And the Democrats did the same thing on the other side. So it was pretty effective, too. So that's the way third-party candidates kind of vote. Let's move on. Okay, let's talk about initiative, referendum, and recall. The initiative allows people to directly place legislation on the ballot for a vote of the people by circumventing the legislature and the governor. So normally, if you want to get a bill signed into law, the legislature has to pass it, the governor has to sign it. With an initiative, proponents of the initiative, or the referendum for that matter, they have to collect a specific number of signatures. So in Arizona, if you want to put an issue on the ballot as an initiative, then you have to get 5% of the signatures from 5% of registered voters who voted in the last gubernatorial election. If it's a constitutional amendment, you need 10%. Well, I take that back. It's 10% for initiative, 15% for a constitutional amendment. There's also a ballot referral, where if people don't like a bill that the legislature passed in Arizona, they can collect signatures equal to 5% of the registered voters who voted in the last governor's race. And then that bill that the legislature passed goes on the next statewide ballot to be voted up or down by the voters. So that's the initiative and the referendum. Some states also require the initiatives to be related to only one subject, the single subject rule. And that's important because if you allow different subjects, you create a greater chance that people will like one subject and dislike another. And then they're in this dilemma where, should I vote for this to get what I like and then hold my nose to what I don't like, or should I vote against it? So a single subject rule reduces this possibility. It doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces the possibility. So if it's an education matter, then everything has to be related to education. You can't slip a transportation or criminal justice issue into the bill. All right, the referendum process, again, has two variations. One type of referendum involves voters who object to a bill passed out of a legislature to put it on the ballot. And again, that requires 5% of the signatures. The second referendum is where a legislature writes a ballot measure and refers it to the voters for their acceptance or rejection at the next statewide election. Now, why would we do that? Legislators use the referendum in divided government where the where the governor is in one party and the legislature is in the other. And if it's a highly partisan bill, the legislature knows the governor is going to veto it. So to avoid the veto, the legislators make it a referral to the ballot, which doesn't go through the governor. The governor can't veto that. It just goes right to the ballot. And we passed a number of measures last election using this process. The Arizona legislature cannot repeal initiatives or referendums and can only amend them by 3/4 vote of both chambers, and only then when the amendment furthers the purpose of the original initiative or referendum. And that was done in response to the legislature many years ago after a voter initiative legalized certain types of marijuana. The legislature came back and just undid it legislatively. So the people were really upset. They came back 2 years later with a constitutional amendment saying if it's a voter-approved initiative or referendum, the legislature can't get rid of it. They can only improve it if it furthers the purpose, and only then by 3/4 vote in both chambers. So, as they say, payback's a bitch. The introduction of the initiative referendum process has decreased the power of the legislature because it took away the monopoly on creating legislation, which increased the power of voters. However, the initiative and the referendum process have become less progressive than their progressive era creators ever envisioned. Now remember, we have these progressive era reforms, and these were in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Progressive farmers, workers, what have you, were upset with big business and corrupt government, and they did a lot of reforms. And the initiative and referendum were part of these reforms because they didn't trust legislatures. Well, today, the processes have been corrupted. It is next to impossible for ordinary people or groups to get enough signatures to put these issues on the ballot. So who puts them on the ballot? You get millionaires and billionaires, often from out of state, put money up, hire groups, get people to collect signatures for payment, and then they get the measure on the ballot and they spend a fortune and outspend the opponents of the measure, and they get it elected into law. Not very democratic, in my opinion. Okay, a recall election involves collecting a designated number of signatures from registered voters on what's called a recall petition. The recall election often entails two questions. First, whether or not to recall or retain the elected official. And by the way, this isn't just legislators. The recall could be a governor, it could be a town council member, a city council member. Any elected official is subject to recall in states that allow it. And then the second question would be, who do you want to replace them? So sometimes people will file to be candidates and their name will be on the ballot. And if the recall petition has enough signatures, then the first question on the ballot is, should Mayor Smith be recalled? And at the end, and then if you vote yes, if a majority vote yes, who do you want to replace him? In other times, the recall petition will trigger election in the future, and people have to collect their own signatures to get on the ballot. So different variations. In Arizona, citizens have 120 days to collect signatures from voters equal to 25% of the votes cast for that office. That's a lot of signatures. I don't think there's ever been I don't know of any recalls of governors, and I don't know of any recalls of even legislators. Once in my town, we recalled the mayor, but it was a low turnout election, so it wasn't that hard to get 25% of the votes cast for mayor. But recalls don't happen too often.